Hi, thanks for coming back. I know you have other options to meet your lecture needs, and I'm glad you chose this one again. Yeah. Okay, so here's a familiar quote from Principia Mathematica, partly authored by Whitehead, as I think you know. So, I've abbreviated it a bit, but they say the following: self-evidence is never more than a part of the reason for accepting an axiom, and it is never indispensable. The reason for acceptance is largely inductive, namely that many propositions which are nearly indubitable can be deduced from it, and no equally plausible way is known by which these propositions could be true. Something like this holds arguably of sub-propositional notions too, concepts in a broad sense of the word. They're accepted some of the time not because they're so shiningly intrinsically intelligible, but because for abductive reasons. Other things that very much seem like they ought to have sense made of them, and their sense depends on the notion in question. That's enough of a reason, oftentimes. If something sort of stands at the center of a cluster of concepts, all of which seem to make sense, and all of their intelligibility seems to sort of stand or fall with this one notion, then that's kind of enough of a reason to think, at least pretend until it starts feeling natural that you understand the notion. And this is how we came to terms. This has been like a familiar theme in recent years, how we came to terms with well, first, Kripkean de Rey modality, essence, plural quantification, the idea of like prior plausibility prior to empirical inquiry. I'm sure some of you like say, yeah, that was a good one, and others you're thinking, I never came to terms with that. That's fine. I only need one example to go with. And of course, the notion of grounds is sort of the most recent kind of entrant in this sort of most recent sort of abductively justified sort of notion that people take seriously. This approach definitely carries a risk of obscurantism, but the alternative in many cases is to kind of misunderstand, either sort of dumb down or in some other way underestimate or disrespect the phenomena that we're trying to make sense of. So I mean, a famous example of this from George Boulos, Plural Quantification. He said, look, we can quantify not just in the sort of singular way, there is an f that such and such and such, but there are some f's that such and such and such. And of course, there is a way of trying to explain this sort of talk without any essential use of plural quantification. You quantify over sets. There is a set whose members do such and such. There's a set whose members are, say, all and only the f's. Well, you shouldn't put it that way. That already uses a plural. But there's a set such that x is an f if and only if x is in the set if and only if x is f. And then you say something about the set. And then Boulos made the point. Let me make clear. I know this is not a definitive point. Okay. But he said, look, if that's really what's going on, if what's really going on with there are some f's that do so and so, that you really mean there's the set of f's has a certain related property, so-and-so star, then what are you going to say about sort of the standard solution to Russell's paradox? There are some things that are too many to form a set. That's what people say. If you translate that, you use the indicated translation, it's like there's a set of things whose members are too many to form a set. And that doesn't seem like the way you want, that's sort of self-undermining, and that's sort of the extent it sort of seems plausible that there are some things that are too many to form a set. You really can't use that sort of translation, and so that's sort of an example of what's, I suppose it's a putative example of what happens if you kind of try to like dumb a notion down to bring it within reach of your existing sort of arsenal. This kind of case can be made, I think, for ways, as in to be scarlet is a way of being red, jumping is a way of moving, to be negatively charged is a way of being charged. Ways might not be that different from grounds, depending on your theory of grounds. There's a notion some people have of how grounds, and ways are kind of like how grounds. So there are lots of phenomena that we might try to elucidate without them, but where the elucidation falls short just because it leaves out the ways. And I'm going to give a bunch of examples, and I'll just sort of pick at random, which I think maybe like don't really get quite what we want. And some of these are blamable on. You never would have heard of the first one if it wasn't for a mistake that I'd earlier made. The other ones are more familiar. So part whole. So here's an idea. Y is part of X if and only if Y cannot change intrinsically without X doing so as well. I'm just going to run down the list and then sort of come back and sort of pick some to criticize. Content. P and Q have the same content if they're true in the same worlds. Containment. Q is contained in, it's part of what is said by P, if and only if Q is implied by P. And there's something very much like this in sort of standard explanations of what makes an argument valid. People will say, every other logic textbook says, well, the conclusion is contained in the premises. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about here. Wittgenstein in the Tractatus says this kind of thing a couple of times. He says, a proposition already asserts every proposition which follows from it. Proportionality, C causes E only if no D strictly weaker than C suffices for E. What I'll call truthiness, it's not quite Steve Colbert's notion of truthiness. So the notion of getting something right. So P gets something right, it's not entirely false if it at least implies a truth, even if it's not itself true. Agreement, P and Q somewhat agree, they partly agree, they don't totally disagree. If they have non-trivial implications in common. Confirmation, let me grant that this is probably a good thing to say in one sense of the word confirm. E confirms A if and only if, E confirms H if and only if H's probability conditional on E is higher than H's standalone probability. Verisimilitude, this is something that Popper said. T is more truth-like than S if think of these as two false theories. Let's just suppose they're logically incomparable. Popper suggests that T is more truth-like than S if T has more true implications and no more false ones. Or, it gets incredibly complicated. It's like, I don't know if you ever read Moore's definition of like a better action in his little book, Ethics, where he goes through every possible case. I can't remember. It's like, this action they both have good consequences, but these are better than those. Or only this has good consequences and this has neutral consequences, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, he goes through every possible case, and that's about half the book. So these explanations are problematic. And I mean, by that I don't mean they're completely wrong and useless. Perhaps they capture some aspect or one disambiguation of one of the notions involved. But say, starting with part whole, this is a point that Jonathan Schaffer made to me. Look, the handlebars are part of the bike. So according to the characterization of part whole that I gave, the handlebars can't change intrinsically without the bike changing intrinsically as well. And Schaffer pointed out, yes, they can. You just have to take them out of the bike first, right? And that's true. A part can change intrinsically without the whole changing intrinsically, as long as it doesn't remain a part. Now that clearly was not what was intended. It's not like, you don't think, that just blows it out of the water. Well, here's the thing. Here's probably what's closer to what you intended. Every way for the part to change intrinsically is a way, or induces a way for the whole to change intrinsically. A way for the part to change intrinsically doesn't comprehend things like taking the handlebars out of the bike. That is not part of a way for, that's something additional to the handlebars changing intrinsically. It doesn't fall under, it's not, if you want to talk in this way, it's not a determinant of changing intrinsically. It's just something that implies changing intrinsically. The business about truthiness, suppose we said that P is truthy or gets something right just in case it implies a truth. Well, there's no proposition, however thoroughly out of touch with the facts, that fails to imply a truth. You just have to take its disjunction with something else. P or 0 equals 1 is like really far from being true, but it implies 0 equals 1 or goats eat cans, and that's true. It doesn't redound to the credit of 0 equals 1. It's you went way off track there, but I'll give this to you. You have that true implication. So what you really want is something, you want to say something like, well, the claim is partly true or it gets something right. If it has an implication of a certain type, it's more intimately related to the thing that it follows from. What I'll be suggesting, ultimately is you're interested in implications whose subject matter is part of the subject matter of the whole. The subject matter of 0 equals 1 or goats eat cans is not contained in the subject matter of 0 equals 1. Let's see, what other ones here? So here's one that, you know, I'm almost afraid to mention, but I did sort of slip it by Susanna earlier. So she didn't completely freak out. Yeah, which is, look, I mean, it's totally standard Bayesian explanation of confirmation. There's a lot of disagreement among Bayesians about what's a good measure of the amount of confirmation, but pretty much everybody agrees that E confirms H, just in case H is probability conditional on E is higher than H's standalone probability. But here's a principle that you might think is plausible. If a piece of evidence refutes a hypothesis, sort of puts it forever beyond belief, makes it unbelievable, then it doesn't confirm that hypothesis. Okay? That's at least, there's one notion of confirmation where if E says, when I hear E, I say, okay, well, I'm never going to believe that hypothesis. And then the Bayesian comes and says, well, it does actually confirm it. That sort of doesn't sit well with it. But this is actually how it works with the Bayesian notion of confirmation because, for example, you know, take the sun has always risen every day up till now. That confirms in the Bayesian sense, today is the last day the sun will ever rise. Why? Because it implies, the sun has always risen up till today but no further. Why is that probabilified? Well, because consequences always probabilify what they're consequences of. And so since it follows from the sun has always risen up till today but no more, that the sun has always risen up till today, that there's bound to be confirmation. And so you might, okay, yeah, I haven't said anything about how you might try to fix that. The Popper idea, and this is a point that was made a long time ago in sort of redirected verisimilitude studies. You know, if S and T are incomparable and they're both false, then S alone implies the truth that if T then S, and T alone implies the truth that if S then T. Right? But so there's no interesting, more, you know, greater verisimilitude relations between false and comparable theories if you define things Popper's way, which kind of defeats the purpose. Okay, so with ways, I want to say these explanations can be fixed or anyway improved or anyway our unhappiness with them can be we can make more sense of it by bringing ways into the picture. So I already mentioned for part hull, maybe what we should say is any way for y to change intrinsically entails an intrinsic change in x. For sameness of content, you know, we're all familiar with the examples like all necessary truths wind up with the same content. Of course, there's many ways of making your peace with this, but one natural move that you could make is, well, you know, P or not P, although it's true in the same worlds as Q or not Q, they're not true in the same, they're not liable to be true in the same ways. P or not P is true in the P way or the not P way. Q or not Q is true in the Q way or not Q way. And indeed, you can think of lots of examples of pairs of sentences, especially like involving relatives and family relations, where you know, it would take you 10 minutes to realize that the sentences actually said the same, were true in the same worlds, and they involve completely different words. And the plausible thing to say is that they're true in the same worlds, but they're true in quite different ways. I spend about a whole, I'm not so good at like whole, you know, what kind of relative is it, a second cousin, et cetera, et cetera. So my proudest accomplishment in this book, Aboutness, is I thought of a very complicated example like this, like nobody's, you know, great aunt has a sister who does so-and-so is equivalent to, anyway, something that doesn't seem to be even about that generation of people. So I have not given you a convincing example, but as people say, evidence of evidence is evidence. If I report that there's a convincing example, I think that should be enough. Containment. So what you need to add, I would say, it's not enough for P to imply Q for Q to contain P. Rather, every way for Q to be true should be implied by a way for P to be true. And to which we might want to add, every way for Q to be true is implied by, indeed is identical to, a way for P to be true. Actually, it's interesting. This point about, you know, when Wittgenstein makes this claim in the Tractatus, you know, that you're implicitly asserting the consequences of what you assert, both Ramsey and Moore point out that this is not what we normally say. So here's Ramsey in his review of the Tractatus in Mind. He says, Wittgenstein is proposing an extension of the meaning of assert. So not quite containment, but what you are inter alia asserting when you assert something. Very similar notion. He's proposing an extension of the meaning of assert only partly in conformity with ordinary usage, which probably agrees as regards P and Q and P, or for all x, fx, and fa, but not otherwise. And Moore makes a very similar point in the Commonplace book with an example involving cats mewing and dogs doing something else. Okay, so that's containment. Now, this proportionality thing, C causes E only if no D strictly weaker than C suffices for E. Well, here's a problem that I didn't mention, but people are pretty familiar with it. The weakest condition sort of sufficient for E is the disjunction of all the conditions sufficient for it. So if you're really looking for the weakest antecedent, given which E is bound to occur, it's that something or other would have occurred given which E was going to occur. So to take an ordinary case of preemption, we want to say it was, Susie threw the rock, it broke the window, Billy's rock sort of sailed through the empty frame. We want to say that Susie's throw, or the fact that Susie threw, or whatever, however you want to regiment it, was the cause of the window's breaking. But if you define proportionality the way I just did, here's something strictly weaker that suffices. Susie threw or Billy threw. But we don't normally think that the fact that Susie threw or Billy threw sort of dethrones the fact that Susie threw. And that, again, I would say, is because it's an implication, but it's not a part. It's not part of what it is for Susie to throw that she or throws or Billy throws. And similarly, it doesn't make it, yeah, okay. Agreement. Hempel actually says this. He says, whenever, I had to look up what the word subcontrary meant, and I've already forgotten. But he says, if two people say things, and what they say aren't subcontraries, which is like they can't both be false together or something like that, then they agree on something, namely the disjunction of what they each said. So there's a lot more. People say, there's a lot of disagreement, in politics. That's much too harsh. Everybody's always agreeing on the disjunction of their various claims. That's what Hempel says that, actually, not about politics. But, he wanted things to work. He's like Carnap. He wanted everything to work out. So a better thing to say is, two people are in partial agreement if part of what the one says is identical to part of what the other one says, where part is explained in the way that containment was explained just a minute ago. Every way for Q to be true is implied by a way for P to be true. Just to give an example of like how that would work. So why is it that 0 equals 1? Sorry, why is it that snow is white does not contain snow is white or goats eat cans? Well, here's a way for snow is white or goats eat cans to be true by way of goats eating cans. But that is not implied by any way for snow is white to be true. His is not one of the ways for snow is white to be true. To be white while goats are meanwhile eating cans. That is not a way for snow to be white. Okay, that's what you'd need. And finally, verisimilitude, and this is a point, so confirmation, at least on one notion of confirmation, again, one that sort of Goodman made a great deal of, and people for understandable reasons sort of got tired of because it seemed too syntactic. You can remember that Goodman was adamant that there's something special about the way the generalization's instances confirm it if it's inductive confirmation, which is that the instance doesn't sort of reflect favorably just on the part of the generalization that is itself. It reflects favorably on the untested part of the generalization. So this black raven reflects favorably on the likelihood of other so far untested ravens being black. People decided that can't really be an important notion. That notion of inductive confirmation can't really be interesting because it's syntactic, and we all know that syntax is not the key to anything. But if you think of it in terms of parts, what Goodman is really saying is there's a sense of confirmation where E really E confirms H if it confirms not just the part of H that is itself, but all the parts. A shouldn't have any parts that E doesn't reflect favorably on. And finally, for verisimilitude, there's a very similar thing. We should say T has more verisimilitude if it has true parts not entailed by S. And then you got to add some and not vice versa, and some other stuff like that. And that's a point that Ken Jeames made a long time ago in a really interesting article. Okay, so much is just to say, I'm reminded of like T.S. Eliot's sort of cat poem. He talks about all these different cats, and they're all doing all these strange things, but none of them can really match this one cat that's like the Napoleon of crime. It controls all their... Is it McCavity? Okay, McCavity, the mystery cat? No. So nobody notices McCavity, just sitting there, but it's really controlling this whole criminal empire. This will give you an idea of my standards for a good analogy. I think that's a good analogy. For like ways are sort of like behind the scenes for a lot of notions that do seem to make intuitive sense, and it's not clear that you could account for how they make sense if you were going to say, well, I don't know what a way is, because they just seem very constitutively tied to ways. So what are ways? Well, ways can't be explained in other terms. That's why it's called primitivism about ways, or treating them as basic. By their fruits you shall know them, and all that kind of stuff. Some commentary may be useful, though. So I'm going to just sort of say several things that might at least guard against certain misunderstandings, or might at least sort of put you in touch of some of what I think is going on with ways, or at least the notion of way that I think is going to be helpful. So first of all, toy model. Just think of very sort of simple languages, including first propositional calculus. So if S is a sentence of propositional calculus, so I'll just stipulate this, its ways of being true are its minimal models, that is, assignments of truth values to atoms in the language that guarantee the truth of the sentence, and such that no subassignment guarantees the truth of the sentence. Quine actually did a bunch of interesting work on something just like this way back when. He defined, so a literal is like an atom or a negated atom, and he said a conjunction of literals is a prime implicant of a sentence, just in case it implies the sentence, and all the conjuncts are necessary. You can't knock any of them out. And Quine actually came up with an algorithm for how to find the prime implicants, which is sort of related to the problem of how do you simplify complicated Boolean formulas, that is still used today. There's this thing called the Quine-McCluskey algorithm. It's in Wikipedia. And now here's the interesting thing. Its main competition is this other method made up by a guy, I might be pronouncing it wrong, Carnot, K-A-R-N-A-U-G-H. It's sort of a similar thing, but its computational complexity is different. And people sort of go back and forth, which is better, the Quine method or the Carnot method. The point of this is that Carnap was not the only Carna with whom Quine's name is linked in history. Because this guy, Carnot, had, anyway, you know, it doesn't get funnier than that, so I better stop. Okay, so what about, yeah, so minimal models line up one-to-one with prime implicants, which are minimal conjunctions of negated and unnegated atoms that imply the sentence S. And indeed, if you want to have like a canonical disjunctive normal form for a sentence, probably one very good candidate for that would be the disjunction of its prime implicants. Okay. And so I'm saying, bringing this to bear on the notion of part, that sort of Q is part of P, thinking of them as propositional calculus formulas, just in case every prime implicant of Q is a subconjunction of a prime implicant of P. And here's some of the results you get if you do it that way. P is part of P and Q. This is on the right-hand side. Not P and Q is part of the exclusive disjunction, P or Q but not both. P or R is part of P and Q or R. P or Q is not part of P. The material conditional is not part of the conjunction, even though it's implied by it. And you can easily kind of think by this as, so here's a way for the material conditional to be true by way of the antecedent being false. The antecedent being false is not implied by any way for P and Q to be true. Starting with the antecedent being false, you can't say, now I'm halfway to making the conjunction true. It's just the opposite. You've prevented the conjunction from being true. The material conditional is part of the biconditional. The biconditional is not part of the conjunction, et cetera, et cetera. You get a lot of results of this kind. Now, what about generalizations? So here I'm just sort of like unloading some things that I think other people have said things like this as well. So there is this idea, especially common when people do generalized quantifier theory, and they're thinking of they're not thinking of for all f's are g's as like for all x, fx, arrow, gx. They're thinking, no, look, there's these things, the f's, and each of them is G, and that's why it's true that all F's are G. So I write that all X colon Fx Gx is the standard way of writing it. This is arguably true by way of certain things being G. Which things? All and only the F's. But that they are all and only the F's is not part of why it's true that all F's are G's. It's part of why they're all being G's is the reason that all F's are G's is true. It's kind of like it's kind of like that the promise wasn't coerced is not part of why you should keep the promise. It's rather part of why the promise means that you should keep the promise. Because if it had been coerced, then that link would have been defeated. I'm saying the same kind of thing. So to do it in first order Rees, you could introduce a conditional connective, sort of diagonal arrow pointing from the bottom left to the top right. So P, diagonal arrow Q, is true in the very same cases, it's true functionally identical to if P then Q, the material conditional, but they hold in different ways. So P, diagonal arrow Q, is true the way that Q is true, supposing that P is true. In other words, so if P is true, then the reason that that conditional is true is just the reason that Q is true. Just like, so if I say, if Rudy is a raven, then Rudy is black, with using the special conditional, that is either true because Rudy is black, that's why it's true, supposing Rudy is indeed a raven. If Rudy is not a raven, it's true trivially, without benefit of truth maker. It just it didn't make any demands on the world, it just gets to be true. Okay, so that's sort of something truth functionally equivalent to the material conditional, but true in different ways. And if you have that conditional, then you can sort of explain the standard kind of generalized quantifier type of universal way of understanding all F's or G's by saying it's for all X, Fx, diagonal arrow, Gx. So everything is such that, ignoring the trivial stuff that isn't F, it's G. So you're speaking of the things that are F, but that you are speaking of the things that are F is, so to speak, like a side constraint or a side fact that isn't part of why it's true that all F's are G's, but it's part of why those things being G is why all F's are G's. Okay, so that gives you some sense of some of what you could do with ways or how you could deploy ways in order to sort of capture what may or may not seem like intuitive notions. Some of them we'll come back to. Now here's the second thing to reflect on when we're thinking about ways. So going back to Frege at least, there are a number of philosophically interesting entities whose whole point and purpose seems to be to satisfy a certain kind of curiosity. So I think Frege says something like this, sort of, numbers are like answers to how many questions. That's like, if you want to know what numbers are there for, so to speak. Well, I mean, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but as Frege was thinking of it anyway, they're there to answer how many questions, right? That's their functional role, if you like. Of course, they have other functional roles, etc. And you might think, amounts. What is an amount? I don't know any better explanation of what an amount is. That it's the kind of thing that answers a how much question. What is a reason? It's the kind of thing that answers a why question. And you can go through a bunch of puzzling. You might think that a truth value is the kind of thing that answers a weather question. Is it the case that S or not? Ways are answers to how questions. Not all how questions. Plus, I don't fully understand how questions, so I'll just sort of say a few things that I kind of half read and didn't completely understand. But I'm like the teacher who's like half a step ahead of the class. You didn't even read these things that I didn't understand, so you'll say, oh, that's probably right. Okay. So how questions come in several varieties, and it's not a well worked out theory of these, but there are at least the following. Hows of means, manner, method, merit, and status. Some of these are terms I made up. Okay, so here's the how of means. This is a joke. How do I get to Carnegie Hall? Practice. You heard this joke. Or by practicing. Okay, that's the way. In the means sense, that's the means that you have to employ to achieve the effect of getting to Carnegie Hall. It's a joke because the person wasn't really asking a means question. They were asking a method question. Sort of, what order of steps do I take in order to get to to Carnegie Hall from where I am right now. So how did they sing? Quietly, or they sang Stormy Monday Blues, say. Those are hows of manner. That sort of says the manner in which the singing occurred. A clue to a how of means is that oftentimes you employ the by locution. You did it by doing that, which is a locution that has a long history in philosophy. I mean, it's important in action theory. Hows of manner very often are verbally encoded with adverbial modifiers, quietly, loudly, carefully, etc. You know, this is another one of those stupid jokes. You know, how do you defuse the bomb? You know, carefully. Okay, so that's not. Again, the person was asking for a method, not a manner in that sense. But nevertheless, carefully is, you know, it ends with ly, so it passes the test. Method. How did she get up there? With a ladder. So typically, or not always, some of the time, hows of method are expressed with prepositional modifiers. Other things are expressed that way too, you know, purposes and so on, but that's at least one occasional sign. Hows of merit. How did you sleep? Badly or well, right? So we'll often respond to how questions by saying, by evaluating the outcome. Yeah, it came off quite nicely, or it didn't come off nicely. And finally, hows of status. This is an example from my own. This is sort of hows of this counts as that. So here's an example from my own long ago experience. When I was trying to become an American, well, to get a green card, I was like reading all the rules, and there was this one interesting sentence that says, you know, if you leave the country in a certain period, that counts conventionally as abandoning your intention to get a green card, which I didn't know that there could be conventions about, like, which, you know, that your intentions could get caught in the web of like obscure immigration laws. But leaving the country, I mean, suppose that's true. So how did you abandon? Someone said, how did he abandon his intention? Leaving the country. That's not the means. It's not like there was some like step that I took as a result. It's sort of like that just counts as abandoning your attention according to that kind of law. Okay. So I want to talk about means and manner. Those are the ones I'm going to mostly focus on. These seem initially at odds because means seem prior. You get to Carnegie Hall by practicing. You practice first, obviously. It's not like you can say, well, look, let's first book me in Carnegie Hall, and then I promise afterwards I will practice. You have to practice first. Whereas manners seem posterior. So you do not sing by singing loudly. The loudness is a property of the singing, not a prequel to the singing. It's something that sort of assumes the singing is already there and then gives you more information about it. But there is a little bit of an area of overlap, and it's in that area of overlap that I think ways in the relevant sense are to be found. So suppose you got a tomato, Tom. How is it read? Here's one answer: by being scarlet. I used by, so that's at least prima facie a how of prima facie a how of means, but of course it's also a how of manner because Tom is scarletly red. In what manner is he red? It's like singing loudly. It's like being scarletly red. It's sort of a thing is read. In what fashion is it read? In what manner is it read? It's the scarlet way. Okay. So I'm sort of thinking there is this tiny area of overlap between hows of means and hows of manner. I'm going to say ways lie in the region of prior manners. Then there's a couple of paragraphs like dealing with diddly issues that might arise and objections you might have to that, which I'm not going to go through because these are not the objections that are likely to occur to you, and if they did, you would not be satisfied by what I say about them. So roughly, to be phi in way psi, as I'm thinking of it, is to be phi both psily, that's the manner, and by being psi, that's the means. So the poster child for this is determinants and determinables. Determinants manage at the same time to be both the manner in which a thing has the determinable and in some sense that in virtue of which the thing has the determinable. So that's why I say prior manner. It also applies to disjuncts and disjunctions. So how is it that snow is black or cold? The cold way. That's sort of a manner, if you like, of being black or cold, but it's also how snow came by its black or coldness. Okay. It manages to be both at once. That's roughly the area that I'm looking in. I get to paraphrase a funny remark of Quine's, as he said in reference to modality. He said, blah, 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 this is the kind of essentialism that's normally associated with Aristotle, subject to correction by Aristotle scholars, such being the penalty for attributions to Aristotle. And so similarly, I'm saying this stuff subject to correction by people who know anything about it, that being the penalty for saying anything, really. There's also a few tests you can try. So whether psiing is really a way of phiing may be amenable in some cases to linguistic tests. If psi exceeds the bounds of phiing, if there's more content to psi that, so to speak, feeds into the needs of phiing, then you could often pedantically correct the claim, I only phied, by saying, no, you also psied. And so there's this wonderful dialogue that Kratzer makes this point in the paper, and I think an investigation into the lumps of thought. And she has two dialogues. Dialogue with a pedant. Pedant, what did you do yesterday evening? Paula, the only thing I did was paint this still life. Pedant, this cannot be true. You must have done something else, like eat, drink, look out the window. Paula, yes, strictly speaking, I did other things. I made myself a cup of tea, I ate a piece of bread, etc. That's the pedant. They're strictly speaking right. You don't want to invite them over again, but they're right. Dialogue with a lunatic. Lunatic, what did you do yesterday evening? The only thing I did was paint this still life. Lunatic, wrong. You also painted these apples and these bananas. That doesn't sound like the right thing to say, because there's nothing more. Painting apples and bananas is completely covered under the heading of your way of painting a still life. You didn't venture outside the requirements of painting a still life when you painted the apples and bananas. And that to some extent is reflected in our use of the word only. If I say you only did this, things that you did just by way of doing the first thing are not counterexamples to that. But if you go a little bit outside, then it is a counterexample. So singing while dancing is not a way of singing. Because if someone's, what did you do last night? I only sang. Ah, that's not true. I was looking through the window. You were dancing as well. Say, all right, okay, I was singing while dancing. But so what did you do last evening? Singing. Say, oh, that's not true. You were singing Stormy Monday Blues. Well, yeah, right? That's how I was. I mean, you can't. Well, I suppose. No, but I'm thinking about there's a lot of tuneless humming in the world that isn't really of any particular song, but generally, you're supposed to sing a particular song when you sing. Okay. Now here's a few features of ways as I'm thinking of them. Ways are closed under conjunction. So take snow's property of being white or cold. One way that snow has that property is by being white. Another way is by being cold. Another way is by being white and cold. It's over the top, but it's kind of like Sulam and the Magnificent's crown. Everything in there is relevant. It's just you didn't need every last bit of it. So I want to say ways are closed under conjunction. This is also something that Kit Fine defends at great length, but not under disjunction. So if you say, how is snow white or cold? This is not a good answer. Well, it's white or cold. That's how it did it, right? So ways are not closed under disjunction. One way can include another. To be blue is one way of being colored. To be indigo is another way of being colored. To be indigo is included is one way of being blue as well. Then there's some stuff about negation. And then a thing about individuation. I'll mention the negation thing. So if psi is not a way of being phi, in other words, psi goes outside the demands of what kind of feeds into being phi, then that shows up under negation. To be not psi is no part of being not phi. And so here is an example. So here's a way of being charged, to be positively charged. That's a good way of being charged. Here's not a good way of being, to be positively charged and in this room and nearby. That is not a way of being charged, because being nearby does not feed in any way into the demands of being charged is not waiting around. After it hears that the thing is negatively charged, it sort of packs up its bag and goes home. It's not saying, yeah, well, where is it? right? It doesn't care. It's enough that it's negatively charged. So here's one way in which that manifests itself. Here's how it manifests itself, that being positively charged and nearby is not a way of being charged. Take the negation of being positively charged and nearby. That's to be not positively charged or far away. Well, I take it that, and the negation, of course, of being charged is to be neutral. To be not positively charged, arguably, is part of being neutral. But this is not part of being neutral. To be not positively charged or far away. Of course, I'm explaining parts in terms of ways, so it's a great big happy circle, but nevertheless, it's a test that you can use in some cases to sort of clarify your intuitions. And then here's something that will be important. If one way to be phi includes an other, well, the other, I called it an other, so it is another. It's not identical to the first one, but I will say it's not a new or further or distinct way. So shouting is a way of making noise. Shouting, "You're standing on my foot," is also a way of making noise, but it's not a new or distinct way over and above shouting. As I'm thinking of it, as I'm thinking of these things, and that will sort of come into a condition a bit later on. So let's take up some issues from last time that I already announced, where I'm mostly just going to rehearse and say a couple of things about them, sort of to get you thinking, well, maybe these things aren't completely disconnected. I'm not going to settle very much, but here's some of the issues from last time. We were left with P2. X is proportional to y, if and only if x suffices for y, and for all x prime that's part of y, that is also, that's part of x, and is sufficient for y, for all parts of x that are sufficient for y, x prime is true in the same worlds as x, where the subject matter of the sentence y is concerned. But I didn't tell you how you find the subject matter of the sentence y, and that was one of the problems. And then there was z is relevant or helpful to the cause of y, if and only if z is part of some x proportional to y. And then we had various issues with that. So the first was, well, we never really explained what it was for little bold y to be for little bold y. I remember once asking Gideon Rosen this kind of question: why is that the thing of that? And he says, look, its subscript is x. That's why it's the thing of x, right? And so you could say, oh, that's why. Why do you think I chose bold y? It's the same letter, right? But that's not the notion. It's not like, why did you choose that notation, but why is it really the case? So I didn't do anything to explain what makes something the subject matter of a sentence. Why? I didn't do anything to explain what makes worlds relevantly different, and you might think that proportionality comes in there. The problem of saying when worlds are relevantly different or relevantly similar is really the problem, well, it's just related to the kind of problem that we're trying to solve. The second problem is, well, one version of it is enabling. So proportional x may contain, in addition to the helpful bits, ingredients to ensure that they do indeed suffice. And so those other ingredients might cut y down to size. They might defeat a defeater of x's helpfulness to y. Various other things can happen. Read Jonathan Dancy. He's got a list of 5 million things that can happen. Then there's the Euthyphro issue. Does x suffice thanks to its helpful parts, z included, or is z helpful because it in the right company suffices? I find that that came up briefly at the end of last time in a question. I won't have anything more to say about that. Then there's helpfulness. Helpfulness, as explained in the condition we just gave, H, is kind of holistic or in situ or extrinsic or whatever in a way that is sometimes used to argue for particularism. Why can't Z be helpful as such? Why is it you've always got to say, it is kind of hard to this goes back to the Raven kind of example, Nicot's criteria. Nicot thinks an instance of a generalization is helpful as such to the generalization. He doesn't say whether, of course, the instance could be surrounded with other stuff. The net effect of the whole package might be to refute the generalization. But nevertheless, it's helpful as such. We haven't made any allowance for that kind of thing. Things are only able to be helpful if they're fighting in a winning cause, right? Because if there's so z is helpful as h defines it, just in case z is part of an x that's proportional to y. Well, part of proportionality is sufficiency. So if you're part of something that obtains that's sufficient for y, then you've had your way, because y, the thing you were helpful to, did indeed come about. So I want to talk about some of these things. What time did we start? Oh, okay, cool. I didn't ask the next question, which is how does that relate to how long I'm allowed to talk? As long as I need? No, I don't think even you want. I know you don't want to say that. Okay, I see. Okay, good. All right. So subject matter. So here's just a way of thinking of what the subject matter of a sentence y is. It's comprised of the sentence's various ways of having its truth value. If you think of the sentence as kind of giving a determinable property of, this could be misleading, but you could say something like this. If you think of the sentence as giving a determinable property of the worlds in which it's true, it's the various determinants. Okay? And then you also have to throw in the ways that the sentences could be false. There's one direction of that is actually kind of, you can almost argue for that on the basis of intuition, which is, I mean, you might think that this is a constraint on when two worlds agree with regard to the subject matter of a sentence. If two worlds are just alike with respect to the subject matter of a sentence, then the sentence should not be true in different ways in those two worlds. Because it would seem like, how on earth could it make for a difference in how a sentence is true in these two worlds if something changes that it wasn't even about? That would seem to be like off stage from the point of view of the sentence, and so it shouldn't be in a position to ground a difference in how the sentence is true. So that tells you that subject matter ought to be at least as fine-grained as ways of being true, and you can perhaps also argue, well, certainly the null hypothesis is that it's exactly as fine-grained as ways of being true, and that's what I'm ways of being true and false. Ways, as I said, are primitive. It's true that ways of being true and false do exclude irrelevant stuff, but that's just who they are. That's not how we define them. That's just what it is to be a way of doing something. We all came into the world knowing that being red and square is not a way of being colored. It's not like we were thinking, well, wait a minute, here's the test. Square isn't relevant to being colored. No, this just comes for free. It's part and parcel of the notion of way, which I'm proposing to treat as primitive. So why is this a good way of defining sentential subject matter? Again, because it makes sense of a number of things that deserve to have sense made of them. So here's one example. We have this notion of, actually the English word for this oftentimes is non sequitur. So in logic, of course we know what a non sequitur is. Its conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. But if you look around at definitions like in the real world of non sequitur, often they're not about that at all. They give examples of one person says one thing and some person says something that seems like it's completely on a different topic, right? They just totally change the topic. And that's another notion of non sequitur. Like if I say, I'm hungry, and you say, I don't think he was there. That counts as a non sequitur. In a very ordinary, intuitive sense of the word. It had nothing to do with what follows from. Here's what it has to do with. The subject matters are, this is Lewis's notion, orthogonal. And that means so P and Q are orthogonal in the relevant sense. Every way for P to be true or false is compatible with every way for Q to be true or false. It's like a strong form of independence. So Q is, of course, there could be probabilistic relations. There could be sort of things that save the day. But that's at least one way in which to capture the notion of, what, you just went off the ranch. I said this and then you said that? Well, you said a thing whose ways of being true are completely independent of the thing I said, its ways of being true are false. Inclusion, I say, so P includes Q if and only if the inference P therefore Q is truth preserving, that's the standard notion, and it's also subject matter preserving, which is defined as follows. Every way for Q to be true or false is implied by a way for P to be true or false. Then there's the notion of instantiation. So there's this feeling that people have had over the years that generalizations ought to include their instances. it seems like at some level that instances ought to stand to a generalization in the same way as like conjuncts stand to conjunctions, maybe even a more intimate way, but they ought to. But of course, if you think of the ordinary logical ways we have of representing instances, suppose it's like all ravens are black, you can say, well, Rudy is black and a raven. Well, that clearly is not included in all ravens are black because it isn't even implied by all ravens are black. All ravens are black does not take a stand on whether this particular thing, Rudy, is black or a raven. So then you think, well, let's try a weaker thing, the material conditional. Either Rudy is not a raven or Rudy is black. That does follow, but for familiar reasons, it seems much too weak because it makes, it makes, my hand as much of an instance of the generalization as a black raven would be. But here's a way you could do it. You could say, we'll just let the generalization be what I said before. For all x, Rx, this upper pointing arrow, Bx, and the instances, Ra, then Ba, the same arrow. Then it really is a part. And that's another kind of reason for thinking this would be a nice way to think of generalizations and instances. Blah, blah, blah. So I'm gonna just skip some stuff in the interest of getting through. So there's this business of enabling. Not everything in an x that is proportional to y is really helpful to y. Some of it, some of the stuff in a proportional x earns its keep, makes itself indispensable in a different way. And again, Dancy has lots of different versions of this. Like it could be an intensifier, or it could be, I can't remember what all of them are. Or it could be an enabler. I mean, an example from causation that doesn't really quite fit this, but it doesn't answer the letter of what I said. But think about the way in which sorry, you didn't do it yet, right? Because you didn't have enough instructions. I'm just going to move on. Yeah. So given that. So the promise is helpful to, I should lend you the car if I promise to, but the promise wasn't coerced, just nullifies a potential defeater. I take it that's an intuitive thing to say. But this might seem to cast doubt on the whole idea of recovering helpfulness from proportionality. Well, without taking that issue on, I don't really know how to take it on. I just want to point out that the problem here is bigger than may seem because it arises already in purely logical contexts, and it's an example of Daniel Munoz's right there. Yeah, that was your example, yeah. All right, okay, I think you've had enough attention. Okay. So that Rudy, a raven, is black is undoubtedly helpful to the cause of all ravens being black. But that Winona, who say a white duck, is not a raven, is important too, and indeed probabilistically might, raise the probability just as much. The fact that the duck the fact that this white thing is a duck, or this non-black thing is a non-raven, to be more precise, but it's in a different way. So again, this is a metaphor, which I'm not apologizing for that. So Rudy's color kind of advances us towards the goalpost of all ravens being black. Winona's species kind of turns back a threat to someone moving the goalposts by bringing this extra thing into the range of things that have to be black for all ravens to be black. I think that's an intuitive distinction, and so the point of that is just to say that already in like baby logic, you can get some of the same phenomena that are thought to be sort of fraught with mystery and lead people into very special positions in moral theory. I can say that because all positions in moral theory are very special to me. Okay, so per se helpfulness. So the final question is to do not with unhelpful ways of figuring in a proportional x, that's like what uncoercedness was supposed to be about, but different ways of being genuinely helpful. I want to say to some extent, these varieties are observable already in the toy truth functional model. So here's a 5-way distinction, not completely precise, but close enough, between different ways that z could be helpful to, to y. So the only one we've defined so far is circumstantially. Z is circumstantially helpful to y if z is part of some proportional x To which I might add that Z might be, not Z might be in a lot more y's that are proportional, a lot more x's that are proportional to y. And Z might be in a lot more y's that are proportional to, I'm saying the wrong thing. I mean, the point is just, at least once, this is the minimal thing that we had, at least once Z had to be there in a proportional condition. That's compatible with, that was the complete fluke. Usually you'd want not Z. And usually Z actually causes trouble. So that's where we are so far. But here's some more things. Statistically helpful. Z is in more x's proportional to y than not Z is. So this would be like, yeah, so circumstantially it might be, disrespect can be a good maker if you're paying disrespect to someone who's probably deserving of that attitude, but respect is likelier to play the role of a good maker, and disrespect is likelier to play the role of a bad maker. It just can happen that disrespect is helpful to to something being a good situation. Here's something a bit, statistically is a bit more like this. Kindness is generally a good maker. It generally counts in favor of the goodness of a situation in which it figures, certainly more often than unkindness does, which is not to deny that unkindness can play that role. So I'm able to say this in a truth functional setting because you can literally count the number of prime implicants, and I can say more or less. In any real example, of course, we'd be talking about worlds, and the cardinalities would all be the same, and so you'd have to have some measure on the set of worlds, and you'd have to have some idea of which sets of worlds are sort of equal in size and so on. Nevertheless, I think something like that probably is the right way to go. Prominently, so here's another thing. So that statistically was Z is in more x's proportional to y than not Z is. So kindness is in more conditions sufficient for goodness, proportional to goodness than unkindness is. Respect carries more responsibility for good outcomes than disrespect does. So if a situation contains respect, already that's a plus. Whereas disrespect has to be accompanied by some story about why that person was like bad enough that it helped to disrespect them. In other words, so respect, so to speak, it already covers like 70 yards all by itself to making the situation good. Whereas disrespect, if it's going to be good, has to be surrounded with a bunch of junk that sort of tells you why its valence changes from what it would normally be. That's what I call differences in prominence. I changed the terminology here so that it doesn't line up with the symbols in the chart below. So I'm going to, instead of saying strictly, I'm going to say only. So Z is only helpful to Y if Z is part of an X proportional to Y, while not Z is not part of any X proportional to Y. So this would be, if suppose you thought kindness is always good-making and unkindness is never good-making, but it's not the case that you can never have a good situation that doesn't have any kindness in it. There are other ways of arranging for good situations. And finally, the last category, I say totally here. I really should say, I've forgotten, invariably, or something like that. Yeah, invariably. If Z is part of all x's proportional to Y, and not Z is part of none. So this would be, kindness is always good, and there can be no goodness without it. That's like the relation that P bears to P and Q, or to P and Q or P and R. It's not just, yeah. Okay, so here's some truth functional examples like this. You can understand these notions. Who cares? I mean, so there's some truth functional examples. You can read them yourself. Because I'm about to say that these distinctions, anyway, are very far from doing justice, like the real issues about when something sort of genuinely sort of counts in favor of something else, even though in weird circumstances it could count against it. But in a way, that's the point. So there is a difference there. This is shallow and superficial. That is deep. And so I'm hoping people will tell me where the additional depth lies. I believe that there's additional depth, but that's, yeah. Okay, so summing up, and then I'm done. Relevance is important. Hume thought he had explained it with minimality, but the explanation doesn't work. A variant using what you might call focused minimality where a certain subject matter is concerned, seems to do better. Subject matter relies, however, on a notion with some of the features that we were trying to explain. This was the Sally point. Worlds being relevantly dissimilar, dissimilar on the score of how y is true in them. Ways make sense of so much, though, that we can in good conscience treat them as primitive, and this is just one of the benefits that we get, a notion of subject matter that serves our purposes. Our justification is abductive in the Russell-Whitehead tradition. Where we come out on this is z is relevant to y if it figures in an x proportional to y. X is proportional if and only if its sufficient parts x prime, though they may be true in different ways, are not true in ways that are new or genuinely additional. That was really the part that I skipped, where the subject matter of y is concerned. Relevance, so defined, is highly circumstantial. What about per se and pro tanto relevance and all that? Can't z fight in a losing cause? No real progress was made on this. Various simplified models were suggested of how you might approach it, with apologies for their superficiality and hopes for a brighter future in which we join hands, the logic people and the people working on deep stuff, and go together into the future. Okay, take that last part. I'm done. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm interested in and puzzled by this notion of a way of being true. And so do you just have in mind truth making? So where a way of being true just is to have a certain truth maker? Or are you open to like maybe a little more esoteric conceptions where there might be like a realm of, I don't know, aesthetic truth and another one of like scientific truth, and they are true in different ways, so there are actually like different kinds of truth? Or is it really just the ordinary truth-making relation?
The first thing is better than the second thing. I mean, I hadn't been thinking about, like, home truth, scientific truth, but I mean, the way you put it is extremely natural. Oh, it's just truth making. But the way I think of it is there's different theories of truth making. This is a very particular kind of truth maker. This is what my candidate for the role of truth maker. Yeah. So, because I mean, it sort of depends on like how vertical you think that the truth making relation can be. I mean, a lot of the sort of imagery is at least, well, the world does this down here, and then this thing up here gets to be true, and it should be glad because the world doing its fundamental magic down here sort of shone some terrific light upward onto the thing. Whereas the way I'm thinking of it, it's just a manner of being true. So it's somewhat. It does have a little bit of a vertical aspect to it, but it also has a horizontal aspect to it. So, but yeah, it's one version of truth maker. So sometimes people actually, Kevin Richardson, an MIT graduate student, has this distinction between how grounds, why grounds, and what grounds, and they're in his terms how grounds. Yeah, and there's people that have written about. Actually, maybe he can. Yeah. Anyway, people have written about how grounds. Yeah.
Hi, Steve. Some of the stuff you said about ways reminded me of things about what natural properties are supposed to do and be like. And I wondered if how close you could make the connection. If maybe a property is natural, if it's a way of being lots of stuff. So, being blue is a way of being Gru. Maybe being Gru isn't a way of being blue, and that is related to the fact that one is natural and the other one isn't. So more generally, I'm just wondering if when you've got hyper-intentional notions like that in there, how much can you do with this that you couldn't do with something like the distinction between natural and unnatural properties?
Well, I think this is somewhat orthogonal. I mean, there's two different issues. Could there be something with ways that, could you say something in terms of ways that might fit with what some people want to say about natural properties? And what you said was interesting. I mean, it's probably not that. I mean, you could say, look, natural properties are not supposed to be disjunctive. To be really disjunctive, as opposed to just written disjunctively, is, to have genuinely different ways of being true. Maybe you want to add to that the ways are more natural than it is, or something like that. So, it could be that there could be some connection. But the way a sentence can be about something very, as far from being natural as, so, a way of being copacetic might be really copacetic, or something. I don't know, it's kind of more, the things that are doing the way work are not supposed to be from, they're supposed to sort of be, they're not supposed to be especially fundamental or natural. But that's not to say that, it's true that ways do have something to do with disjunctiveness, but not entirely, because determinables also have lots of ways of obtaining, and at least one theory of what distinguishes a determinable from, well, one idea about determinables, they're not disjunctive. They somehow, that you're disjoining all the different shades of red, and it's getting less and less natural. And then you put the last one in, and boom, it suddenly became natural again. Yeah. So it's no longer disjunctive, even though it's written disjunctively. Yeah. So all I'm saying is I would like to think about that more. That sounds good. Do you want? Did you have a follow-up?
So just if you were happy to talk about the naturalness of propositions, for instance, as like a generalization of naturalness of properties, then maybe the same thing as saying that some of the subsets of worlds are ways of being X would be the same thing as saying that those are the natural, that's the natural way of dividing up the proposition into little bits. Something like that?
Yeah, something like that sounds like it could be right. That would give you natural. I mean, I'd like to think there's such a thing as sort of natural decompositions, but that's sort of a relational matter between the sort of what you decompose it into and what it came from. It isn't a complement naturalness wise to the things you decompose it into. Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out whether there is a portion of your view which is portable, in that it can be extracted from some of the new ideology that you introduce, and can maybe be applied by someone like me who wants to deal with a more meager set of resources. So I wonder whether you could comment on this use of some of your ideas. So someone might think that if you have a sentence, you at least want to associate with it a set of possible worlds, a set of worlds where it's true. But inspired by your work, someone might say, no. Let's associate more with that sentence. We're going to both associate that set of worlds, but also what I'll call its positive grounds and its negative grounds. So positive grounds are sets of worlds that entail the truth condition of the sentence. Negative grounds are sets of worlds that entail the complement, but they're to be treated as distinguished. So they're going to play a special role, and it's a role which is kind of like the role that the prime implicants of a sentence of propositional calculus play. And then we remain neutral as to the implementation of your view I'm thinking of. We remain neutral as to exactly how these special grounds are chosen. We just say, well, look, it's an additional semantic property of a sentence, which we're going to use through the theoretical work, and maybe one can take different views about just how that comes about. And then once you have that, then that's enough to characterize a notion of way. I mean, maybe it's more coarse-grained in some ways than what you want, but you have a notion of way, and then you can just like use all of the wonderful machinery you've developed, and get some of the notions that you've been working so hard to construct. Is that does that make sense?
That sounds very much in the same spirit. It's sort of like maybe we could think of it like, I mean, this is a general strategy for creating fine-grained, unstructured propositions. Is you take the sets of worlds, and then you take a bunch of subsets of them, and you could choose difference. That's basically what the ways are, or the grounds. And so everything's still unstructured, but it's finer grained, and it's also the kind of thing that potentially can go as deep as you like. You could make even finer grained by taking subsets of some of those subsets and thinking, where do they come from? So there's a kind of a structural, there's an architectural sort of idea that you could see all the particulars that I've been giving are just like a proof of, maybe not even a proof of concept, but sort of like, here's one way it could work. Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. So can I now assume that you will not write the kind of paper that you've written about essence and other stuff, like trying to like show it?
Thank you. So I was wondering if, I was trying to get a feel for what the most basic driving idea is, and it seems like it's something like a default notion of helpfulness. So, we're obviously getting at that with the increasing scales from circumstantially up to totally. And I sort of wonder if maybe the notion of a default could get explained in terms of the notion of a reason. And then going back to also what we started with, sufficiency and necessity. So we have this notion of a kind of direct reason why, or a cause, or a ground, or something like that. But we also have started to admit that there are other ways of being helpful besides being kind of the direct cause, reason, or ground. There's sort of things that keep the goalposts from being moved too much. Like, if there had been more ravens, there would have been more things that had to be black. And then we also have notions of, just like all the Dancy 5 million list. And so I wanted to wonder if maybe we can understand these in terms of reasons why things are necessary and sufficient. I think you actually talk about this in your definition way back when of, not that long ago, don't worry, but like of enablers and ennoblers. So there are reasons why, and then there are reasons why something is sufficient. And that would be an enabler. Yeah. So the reason why, these things being black was sufficient for there being all black ravens, all the ravens being black, so there were no more ravens. But then also there are reasons why something was necessary.
Yeah.
The fact that something's a raven is like, oh, it better be black, or else, there goes our universal generalization. So, there it seems like you have the start of a kind of complete family of notions. Reason why it's necessary, and reason why it's sufficient. And then the notion of a default could be no reason needed, or something like that.
Oh.
So you get the whole family of ways and from the notion of a reason, and then the kind of trivial notion of no reason needed.
Yeah, but I like that. I like that basic idea that it's important to distinguish levels. There's this is a reason for that because of something else. This is a cause of that because this other thing that would have caused it finked out or something like that. So it's the thing that it's finking out didn't help to cause the effect. It put the effect in need of this additional thing that does count as the cause. But I didn't quite get the part about like no reasons. I mean, one way to think of it is this. I mean, someone might think like in a Carnapian mode, and I think C.I. Lewis actually had this kind of idea. So the meaning postulates, maybe I'm thinking of it more semantically, now than metaphysically, are default rules. So F's are G's unless there's a reason why not. And there's various formalisms that people have for representing default rules. So, F's are G's unless to suppose that this one is G produces an inconsistency or something like that. And so that would, so one way to bring in the reasons would be, it's like Wittgenstein's notion of a criterion, sort of, some things are semantically, for semantic reasons, good evidence, defeasible but good evidence for something else. But it's just that's just a whole other world of pain to try to figure out what any of that stuff means. But so I was sort of experimenting with whether you could recover any aspects of this kind of counting in favor of just with like simple counting like cases, and I suppose I'm not especially optimistic about it, and so then probably it will be led to something like what you're saying, but I'm still trying to not do that. Yeah.
So I got a little confused at the end when you went through the 5 ways of being helpful on the top of the 4th page. I mean, this is partially about the, you were trying to be sort of, sort of non-committal about the ontological category of what the different variables are picking out. But I was interpreting the little -z as being negation.
Yeah.
Negation, right? So it's not.
Yeah.
But then when you did the examples, so I would have thought then it would have been like non-z's. And then when you did the examples, it became un-z's.
I know. I cheated. I
And,
totally cheated. I chose respect and kindness because unkindness sounds like it's the negation of kindness, but it really isn't.
But it isn't. So,
Yeah.
yes. But then I worry that, well, but can you do the same thing with non-kindness? Does it not, So for this particular application, it looks like you need the un one.
Yeah.
But then for a lot of the other things you want to do, there's no such thing as like an unevent. There's just the non one. So I worry whether it's the general account that can be applied in both of the cases when you have to use the un sometimes and the non some other times, and more generally whether the un-non seems like another distinction that you might make within this stuff.
Well, I mean, in good conscience, I should only be using the non, at least for this simple model, and I was just like using the un as like an intuition pump.
Okay, so the claim is it would go through if non too or something. Yeah.
It just might not be as sort of evident. Yeah. Like, because you might think it's sort of clear how kind of unkindness is bad making. I could tell a story about like how absence of kindness like was a problem too, but it would be a longer story. Yeah. No, you're completely right. So it's one more shortcut. That's a polite word for what it is. It's a lie.
So I'm not quite sure I understand the relationship between the ontology of ways and the grammatical observations about how questions. And one reason is that means, when you're talking about means, there's sometimes when you seem to be talking about like instrumental means, and sometimes you seem to be talking as if like means is like scarlet is a means for being red, which that just seems like, nah, sorry, not the same thing. And so I wasn't quite sure. In fact, I am not completely comfortable even with scarlet being an answer to the how is something red. That doesn't sound quite right to me. Mm-hmm. And I'm more inclined to think of asking what scarlet is you're saying it's a way of, you might get ways of being red, but take it this way. When I want to say, what is a human is an animal right? And what is an animal? It's a living being. That there are kinds of a set of what questions that are more relevant to the in virtue of stuff.
Yeah.
And the means stuff is something else. And I'm asking one hand a methodological question about, I don't quite get how the grammar and the ontology are supposed to be interacting here, and what's supposed to be trumping what. And the other is, how should we understand the difference in the relation between what questions and how questions? And I know that's too big to answer, but do you have any thoughts about that? Because I don't like red and scarlet. I mean, they can be wet. Oh, never mind. You know what I'm asking.
So you don't mind saying that scarlet is a way of being red. You just think that it's unnatural to link that to, well, scarlet is a good answer to how is this thing red.
Yeah, I don't like that
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And scarlet is a way of being red. It depends on a way. It depends. It's not a means of being red.
No, right.
No, but you had it in a means.
Well, it's not. Here's the way I sometimes think of it. I don't know if this really kind of helps at all. I mean, think of the sort of how of means as linked to the bilocution somehow. Hold on, and then roughly Q is a way for P to obtain if thinking of the world as kind of like an agent. The agent makes it the case that P by making it the case. So the agent wants to make it the case that there is a certain kind of instrumentality in the sense that the agent can't just make something red. You have to, and that's in a stronger sense than you can't just have someone sing. You have to settle on a volume. That's true, but you see there's a difference between you have to settle on a shade of red and you have to settle on a volume. It's just unavoidable that singings are some volume or other, but it's not. So one way of trying to square the circle, I don't really have a good answer, is to bring in this last example, the last notion of how, which is hows of status. So it's like, how are they married? They've been living together for 7 years in a state with common law marriage or something like that. So the priority that there is not their being married is brought about, but it's sort of like there's another kind of priority which is qualifications. You have to meet this condition to be this. You may have been this all along, but still it was meeting this condition that sort of gave you that status. And I do feel that way. So I feel like there could be a metaphysical priority that's more naturally suggested by the word means that makes it sort of seem like, I don't know, there's something like causation happening. But there's another kind of priority that goes with what entitles it to be so regarded. Yeah, I don't know. We'll talk about this later. There is actually a view of these hows of statuses that links them very much to what questions.
Yeah, so this is about clarification partly. So is the new notion of subject matter that you're using one in which every way for something to be includes several further ways for that thing to be? So for instance, I'm thinking, so for instance, Chiardelli and Rolofsen and other people who work on questions have these downward closed sets of answers. Is that how you're thinking about subject matters?
No. I mean, I'd like there to be the possibility. I mean, I want to attach some well, I guess there's a couple things. I do think it's important to, in some contexts, to distinguish sort of proximate ways from like ways in which those ways obtain. In other words, I think that there can be ways that are at a greater distance or a closer, from the thing that they're ways of being. So indigo is further from colored than blue is. So the inquisitive logic stuff you're talking about, they just let you that's just in some ways exactly what I want not to do. They just let you make the ways stronger and stronger along any dimension you like, even if it's not along the dimension that you're talking about. So one way to sing is to do exactly the following, and you give all. As I seem to remember it, even one-word answers have to be included for them, and I don't. That goes against what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Hi. I think I have kind of the same concern as Sally, and I want to say that singing while dancing is a way of singing. So consider this example. Fred really wants to get into a singing contest. So he goes to the audition, and Fred sings loudly while dancing, okay? And he gets a spot, and he winds up winning the contest, okay? So why did he win, or how did he win the audition? Well, he got the judges' notice by singing loudly, right? He would have won a spot if he just stood still, right? But the contest is all about singing while doing some activity, right? So he won the contest because he was singing while dancing. So
Yeah, but that sounds like different ways of winning the contest. It's not obvious that it's different ways of singing.
why not?
Well, so far we just have my unopposed assertion to the contrary. And then you said, well, maybe it's like this, but it didn't. But I mean, I just take it there's some. There's, I mean, this is. I guess this is a thing people say a lot of the time in the causation literature when you're trying to find a proportional cause. There's one thing you can do, which is to sort of make the cause more refined, which is sort of going on in the same direction, so to speak. Another thing you could do, which is just add collateral detail, which isn't sort of, just sort of bringing in. It's sort of like the way in which we say, for a thing to be red gives you more detail about how it's colored. To be red while France doesn't have a king does not give you more detail about how it's colored. And people that talk about, well, in the causation literature, this is important, and people talk about Cambridge properties and so on, this is important. And I don't know where it ultimately comes from, but we all have this sort of feeling like that's cheating, where somebody says, oh, you forgot, I say, oh, let me tell you all about Roxanne or something, this, that, and the other. And they say, you're not finished. You didn't tell me whether she has those properties while the Greenland ice pack is shrinking.
Singing contest, you have to do it. You have to sing in a particular way that incorporates some other activity. So the way that they're singing is singing while dancing.
Well, you have to. I mean, I'm the last person to say this. This sounds like it's just semantics. but I mean, so there could be a use of, you have to sing in a particular. In some contests, you might have to wear a fuddy hat or something. To when maybe that would give you enough context that you could say, well, how did he sing? Oh, with a kangaroo hat on or something like that. But I just think it takes some work to make it seem that way. I don't know where it ultimately comes from. I just submit that there is in fact, I got tons of objections on exactly this front when I sort of was doing some stuff with proportionality and causation, and people said, you're allowing, the way you defined it, being P and Q is a way of being P, and that's a problem. And I think it is a problem if you're really talking about ways narrowly understood. It might not be a problem for other things like causal competition and so on. But I just take it that, I don't have any deeper reason why this is sort of a natural distinction. So what you're saying, I don't have an answer to it, but it seems in some ways like a skeptical. You say, tell me why, singing while you're 43 years old isn't a way of singing. I don't know anything more that I could say about that. It's just like,
So do you think context plays any role in determining what counts as a way of doing something?
in the same way as in the literature on questions, there's like answers strictu dictu, and then there's pieces of information which, given the common ground, actually steer you towards which of those answers might be correct. There might be a similar thing with ways. In other words, so for example, it could be that I always bring my trombone when I'm going to sort of play a certain kind of song or something. So how did he sing? Well, he brought the trombone. Well, bringing a trombone is not a way of singing, but it might in context sort of clue you into what the way of singing was. Yeah.
So this is a follow-up on Roxanne's, I think. I'm wondering if there's when there's cases of disagreement, how you understand the disagreement. So compare some discussions of natural properties. Like someone like Ted Sider thinks that aliens who carve up, distinguish different properties as perfectly natural from us, either we or they are making a mistake, even if we all have true beliefs. And he also thinks that that it's not context sensitive. Which properties are natural, but you can imagine a contrary view that says, well, it kind of depends which explanatory discipline you're in. If you're doing physics, relative to that context, these are natural. If you're doing chemistry, it's these ones. Yeah. And actually, I thought Roxanne was right, and that a natural thing for you to say would be context can shift which things are the ways. So there are really two questions. Why can't it? And would aliens who understood what we meant when we said this is red and understood what we meant when we said this is red and round, but persisted in thinking that it's being red and round was a way of its being red, would they be making a mistake on your view, or is it just their architecture is different?
Well, I guess a couple of things. One is, I totally agree that ways can shift with context. I would have taken a lot more context for me to sort of see how just like adding on a conjunct was the way. Look, I'm doing like Straussonian descriptive metaphysics. Martians can do it their way, we do it our way. So it's sort of from it's like an imminent, not a transcendent observation I'm trying to make when I say there's a difference between just sort of piling on collateral detail and further specifying something that already was partly specified. Now, I totally agree. Like, so for example, normally no Fs are, no birds are telepathic. It's about birds. But you could imagine like a conversation about, well, is anything telepathic? So I don't know. I'll tell you this, no, birds are telepathic. Now it's not about birds, it's about the telepathic things. That kind of thing can happen. And so that's a change in subject matter, and for me that has to be a difference in ways of being true. So I do think context can change these things, and I don't have a full story about it, but I wanted to be in a somewhat disciplined way. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, it does seem like there's a deeper issue, which the example of the debates about natural properties brings out. Like, so you can imagine someone reading Lewis and Sider and thinking, oh, I'm convinced that we need this notion of natural property, but I actually think that we're going to get clarity and insight into how that distinction is drawn if we pay attention to like what our needs are as inquirers. Like, yeah. And it could be in some sense you still you don't try to analyze the notion of natural property in other terms, but you do say, we can sort of make it intelligible why we draw the distinction we do in one way or another, perhaps in different contexts by reference to what it is we need to understand.
Yeah.
And in the same way here, and that's just a very, very different perspective from the one Sider takes, for example, which is to sort of reverse that order of priority. So would you take a stand on how we should think about
that? To me is like
future work on ways, Steve? Should it go with we'll gain insight into why we carve up the ways we do if we think first about things like what we need to understand the world around us, or is that the wrong way of approaching it?
I'm trying not to think of it that way. I mean, I think naturalness is like supposed to play a certain functional role. It's supposed to do this, that, and the other, and then people argue, can anything really do that? It's not as though we first... I mean, Lewis got people to sort of buy the idea by saying, here's the 9 things that it does, and then people say, oh, it isn't the same thing. What I'm thinking of ways as, it's not, I think we understand, it's sort of like if somebody says, well, I'll tell you what moral attributions are for. They're to increase the survival value of a practice. Because I'm a social Darwinist or something like that. That seems like a different thing to sort of self-consciously ask yourself, well, in the service of what are we talking this way, and is there another way we could talk? I mean, that is a thing that can certainly happen, but I think I'm trying to think of I think there's a bunch of stuff we know about ways that people, by and large, agree about that they don't get to by saying, here's the, you know. I mean, I did say some things that I thought ways could do, but I didn't say, I just took your intuitive notion of ways, at least I was trying to, yeah. In other words, ways isn't the I know not what. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't supposing that it was, but all right.
But a functional notion is like that. It's sort of like, there's something that, oh. You can't use the word relevant, that's my word.
It was really just, you know, I mean, we could start with just a simple thought. If we encounter creatures with whom we can communicate, but their understanding of what's a way of what is fundamentally different from us, are they making a mistake? Or
no. I mean, it's an immanent notion. I might not want to translate their word as way, depending on how it goes. I'm not sure I complete. If it's an immanent notion, then I mean, it's sort of like if we met another group whose notion of copacetic was different from ours or something. I mean, it's like, is it that, or that they mean a slightly different thing by the word? If you're doing immanent metaphysics, then I'm not seeing the distinction very clearly. Yeah.
Hi, Steve. So I have a feeling I know how you're going to answer this, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. So for the disjunctions are made true by their disjuncts, right? I mean, I take that's the lesson of the like scarlet and red and that kind of thing. But there are sentences, right, where we want to maybe think the disjunction is true, but neither disjuncts are true, right? Because like, I don't know, conditional excluded middle, we like conditional excluded middle, but there are cases where we don't think it's true that if the coin had been flipped, it would have landed heads, or it's true that if the coin had been flipped, it wouldn't have landed heads.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just curious, like, what your thoughts are on cases
Yeah.
like that for this truth-making.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's different ways of approaching these matters. The way, say, Kit Fine does it is it's compositional, and so yes, a disjunction gets its truth makers by just taking the truth makers for the disjuncts. I don't want to do it that way because perhaps this isn't quite the example that you're talking about, but I'm interested in the possible. So take the material conditional, you know, if P then P and Q, which is really a disjunction, not P or P and Q. I think, you know, one truth maker of that is Q. Q doesn't decide. It doesn't take sides between those two disjuncts. It just ensures that one or the other one of them has got to be right. And I think that's really important for certain issues, as you know. I mean, it's related to logical subtraction. So some of the time when we say, I think, you know, if A then C, we're precisely interested in a fact that bridges the gap between A and C, which is different from a fact that refutes A, or so you might speak of like synergistic truth makers. And then, of course, there's also what do you want to do about spurious disjunctiveness, like, you know, snow is white and I'm hungry, or it's white and I'm not hungry. You know, so one way to go would be to say, well, you've got to decide whether you're hungry or not before you know why that's true. But it seems like the fact that snow is white seems like it goes a good long distance towards, yeah. And so, yeah. So I think there are certain cases where like a syntactic or structural notion of truth maker can be really, really important. And there's other cases where it wouldn't be. So here's one where it's really, really important. Like suppose you're doing like scalar implicatures, right? So if I say P or Q, I'm probably implicating, if I'm knowledgeable, that they don't both hold. But if I say P or Q or P and Q, then I'm probably not implicating that they don't both hold. But of course, those are logically equivalent. But to get that result, I've got to say that one of the truth makers for P or Q or P and Q is the fact that P and Q is just stronger than it needs to be. So sometimes there's a lot of different applications. Sometimes it helps to be compositional, sometimes less so, yeah. I don't know about conditional excluded mill, yeah. That probably is a different case, yeah. I don't know.
So I'm asking about confirmation again. So you pointed out that you can have probability raising, so you can probabilify H or increase H's probability, and yet be like a very strong reason to not believe H. And this maybe seems like a bad thing. And then you have a proposal that involves bringing ways into the picture of alternative kind of confirmation that gets around this. So I'm wondering if there's a different way of getting around the problem. So an old way. So Carnap distinguished between incremental and absolute confirmation,
yes.
right? Incremental confirmation is just probability raising, and then absolute confirmation is raising above a threshold. So I was thinking, well, that absolute confirmation isn't going to have this feature that E can both confirm H and be an excellent reason for disbelieving it. So I was wondering if maybe someone could just wheel in that distinction instead of bringing ways into the picture.
Yeah. Well, yeah, right. Well, you could. I mean, there's something that ways do that absolute confirmation doesn't, which I don't know how much it matters. So suppose I take, all ravens are black and there are dogs. Everybody knows there are dogs. So, if I see enough black ravens, I get, absolute confirmation for all ravens are black. And I get incremental and absolute. But there still seems to be something. I mean, Goodman would say there's something a little bit funny about that because there are dogs is just a hanger on, and so that's where I would use. But yeah, there is that distinction, and it goes a certain distance. I grant you. I have to talk about it some more with you.
Microphone, please.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Is the way that that's triangular the same as the way that it's trilateral?
No.
Then how are we getting, then it's somehow structure is entering into the content, via the ways. Because you can't individuate the ways in terms of things like, possible worlds and tensions or something like that. So, if you answer that way, then the content of that's trilateral and that's triangular don't have to be the same because, But it sounds like structured content is kind of sneaking in the back door because the way we individuate content is in terms of something that can't be reduced to unstructured sets of worlds or functions simply defined on the domain world. Is that clear?
Well, but I need to hear a bit more because you can have these say unstructured proposition that these lengths form a Pythagorean triple or something. They're 3, 4, and 5 or something like that. That's still an unstructured. That can just still be a set of worlds. So you get the set of worlds where you have, let's say, Pythagorean triangle. You could divide that. it's also the same set of worlds as if you had a Pythagorean trilateral. But if it was a Pythagorean, if you think Pythagorean trilateral, you're likely to divide it up in terms of, well, what are the lengths, or what are the ratios between the lengths? Now, I say you're likely to. Maybe that's what you're really pushing. Where did that come from if it wasn't the compositional semantics?
I guess the idea is that, if you asked about the ontology of the content, it would be the contents are not simply, unstructured sets. They're sets that have a structure imposed on them by something that looks like, universals or properties, or where those can't be individuated in the way that we learn to do it in possible world semantics. So, I mean, something like structured content is, or something like structures sneaking in the back door via the ways, which...
Well, I think grammatical structure is part of what gets you to what, gets you to the ways, and that's a part of, you can think of like the particular sentence employed as a piece of the context itself, that maybe sort of puts you in mind of different ways. But what gets you the ways could be structured without the way. It's just like a set with a bunch of subsets. That's completely unstructured. It's just like, like a cover in topology. A cover is, you got a set and you've got a bunch of subsets whose union includes the whole set. Well, in this case, it would be exactly the whole set. That's just more of the same. It's just piling on more sets, but maybe it's sort of I'm sort of hiding behind this like just more sets when you're saying really what's going on is like, you should know the Russellian proposition, and then you'd be able to figure out which sets they are. And in a way, I don't disagree with that. I just want to insist that context can overcome these sorts of things. Like, no F's are G's can be about the G's. The King of France is bald can be about the bald people in the right context. So you can't just read it off. That's part of what I don't like about the Russellian way of fine-graining, that it's sort of it's sort of, maybe this isn't quite right, you'll tell me, but it sort of seems like you build it all up compositionally, you do it with lambda abstracts or whatever, and then you've done it, and then you're done. And it's sort of, but it seems like, somebody like says it a bit differently, and it should be completely different. People refer back to, anyway, so I want something that's more flexible. Maybe there are ways Russellians handle that, I just don't know, yeah.
Well, if it wasn't 3 after 6, we could continue.
Okay, thank you.